Welcome to Peninsula Seniors Out and About. Today we're at the Western Museum of Flight in Torrance for one of their celebrity lectures. Let's go see what Cindy has for us today.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Cindy Maka, and I'm the director of the Western Museum of Flight. Thank you all for coming today. George Marrett has been selected for induction as a fellow of the prestigious Society of Experimental Test Pilots, and he will be inducted next month. He is also the author of several significant books, including The Aviator, which, due to its creative story and broad appeal, was made into a very popular and highly successful feature film. And George is, of course, a longtime enthusiast of aviation history and also a longtime friend of the Western Museum of Flight. It is my privilege to introduce to you today George Marrett.
Well, thank you, Cindy, and it's good to see a full crowd. This morning I'm going to talk a little bit about Howard Hughes, and I titled this Crazy as a Fox, and I hope I can explain to you why I think Howard Hughes was crazy as a fox. I wrote a book called Howard Hughes Aviator. It came out about 5 or 6 years ago, and it was the result of my interviewing people that knew Howard Hughes. I was a test pilot for Hughes Aircraft Company starting in 1969 to 1989. And I might recognize over here Dick Graylow. Hold your hand up, Dick. Dick was a test pilot during my time period. We flew several programs together, including the F-14 Tomcat, Phoenix, and AWG-9 missile. We were the project pilots for the F-15 radar, and so we had a long connection in flying. He was a former Navy pilot. I was a former Air Force. At any rate, I just came back from Southeast Asia and joined Hughes Aircraft Company in 1969. Had flown 188 combat missions in Southeast Asia. Before that, I'd gone through the Air Force Test Pilot School out at Edwards Air Force Base, and then flew the combat. So kind of a perfect background for Hughes Aircraft Company, which really wasn't making aircraft. They were making missiles and radars, infrared systems, and all kinds of displays. This shows a photograph of me standing in front of the F-111B, and a Grumman aircraft that had the AWG-9 and Phoenix missile on board it. We were flying out of the runway at Culver City, which has long been gone. This is what the Culver City facility, the runway, looked like during my time period. This is 8,200 feet runway from here to here. This is just for directions. This is Lincoln Boulevard, Jefferson. The Loyola University sits up here, and this, of course, is Marina Del Rey in the Pacific Ocean. So you're looking kind of towards the west. That's the way it looked in that time period in the 70s during when we were flying. It was closed essentially in 1980, and there's no runway anymore. It's been heavily developed. There's only a few buildings left, including where the flying boat was built, which was right in there. That is still there. So that's what it looked like 1970 during my time period. This is how it looked 1943. Howard had become an aviator back in the 20s. He had his own company. He was interested in building airplanes for the upcoming war. And there's no question that there was a war coming. So he bought this land out here. I think it was around 1,200 acres, built some facility. This was a dirt strip with actually a power line that went across here. So you either had to land in front of the power line or land beyond the power line. And it was kind of funny because one of the guys that I interviewed, Howard didn't like it, obviously, to have that power line going across there. And so they had a special project going, and one of the engineers, it had to do with chaff. And so they had a P-51 that was going to drop some chaff. So the engineer had him drop the chaff right across here, and it sparks and everything blew it out. And so the power company came in there and cut it down. So they got what they wanted, but kind of a backward way. But at any rate, that was the Hughes facility during the time period that Howard flew out of there. So what my plan is that I was able to interview probably 23, 24 people that had a direct connection with Howard Hughes in aviation. I wasn't interested in the movies, wasn't interested in the girls, all the other things that you hear about with Howard Hughes. It was Howard and aviation, airplanes. Why did he buy the airplanes? What did he do with them? Whatever happened with them? And so during my time period working with Hughes Aircraft Company, there were still a few people around that had maintained his airplanes. Some of our airplanes that Dick and I flew, we had people that were mechanics that had worked on Howard's airplanes. The senior test pilots that we worked for were pilots for the most part that Howard had hired right after the war. And now they're in the late 40s, early 50s, they're beginning to give up flying, and a new generation of guys had come in. It was still a private company. Howard owned it. Nobody knew for sure exactly where Howard was. He was in Vegas for a part of this time period. He was known to come to the Culver City plant, fly into the plant at night. Daytime, he could come at any time. And of course, one of the funny thing was, it was his airport, so, and his control tower, but he didn't talk to the control tower any more than you would when you go home and open up your garage door, right? You don't call somebody and say, I'm coming home. Howard didn't either, so he could just show up. And I always had people wondering what we would do if he showed up. So let's talk a little bit about Howard Hughes now. For those people that don't know, Howard was born in 1905 in Texas. His dad had designed and owned the Hughes Tool Company, which had a drill bit for drilling for oil. And of course, this we're talking now, Howard born in 1905. Oil was very big in Houston, or in Texas and in Oklahoma in the 20s. And this drill bit was world class. It would go through any kind of rock. So his dad made a fortune from that. Unfortunately, Howard had no brothers, had no sisters. His mother died when he was like 14 years old. His dad died, I think, when he was 18. So he was, in some respect, kind of an orphan. He had to grow up pretty fast. And so he wasn't interested in the oil company other than the money that would come out of it. So he worked a deal where he could buy out his dad's partner, so now he owned the Hughes Tool Company. And he moved out to California, out here where we are. A lot of us moved out for the same reason. Good weather, golf, flying, movies, and so forth were just cooking at that time. He had an uncle who was a screenwriter in Hollywood. And so he came out and played golf, was a pretty good golfer, I understand, a handicap of about 2. And so he saw these airplanes flying over, decided to become a pilot. And then he started kind of connecting aviation with the movies, Hell's Angels, and so he loved flying. I think that was something he really, really liked to do. He tended to be kind of a loner. He liked to fly at night because there wasn't as much traffic at night. There wasn't as much turbulence at night. He learned how to fly in a very early time period with several different instructors, unlike it is in this day and age, and also not very much in the way of federal air regulations. So a different time period, and I'm not sure he ever really went beyond that. And I'll kind of explain that as we continue on. So that's basically the start of Howard Hughes and how he got into aviation. Well, he flew a variety of airplanes, ended up flying an airplane that he had modified quite a bit in a race in Florida. And he did pretty good in what was called the sportsman category. But it didn't go as fast as he wanted to go, and so he decided that he would build the fastest airplane in the world of that time period. And so he came back to California, and he had Noah Dietrich and other people. I might add, one of the things that I found in interviewing people and going over Howard's background is that he had the ability to hire very good people. And that continued on with Hughes Aircraft Company. The managers of the company, as Howard, after 1953, had very little to do with the aircraft company, but they continued to hire good people like Dick and I, and Paul Kennard, and a whole batch of other people, and it was a very successful company. So he hired a guy by the name of Richard Palmer, who did pretty much the designer of this airplane. This was called the Racer, mystery ship. And was in the movie The Aviator. How many people saw the movie The Aviator? Wow, quite a few. Well, we'll talk a little bit about that also. The big thing about this, of course, was it was very sleek. It did have retractable landing gear and flush-mounted rivets. So at that time period, the way to go fast, of course, is to have a little drag and as much power as you could. So even you notice the engine here has the cowling on it that made it pretty streamlined. So his idea was to build the airplane and have it ready for the transcontinental race that would go, what was it, I think the Thompson Trophy that went from California out to Cleveland. But he had some problems with the airplane when it was first built, some oil leaks, and he wasn't sure it was very reliable. So he missed the air races, and so he decided that he would go down to Southern California, the present position of Orange County Airport, and he set a world speed record. So he made multiple passes back and forth to zero out the wind, 8 or 9 of these, and averaged 352 miles per hour, which was a world record for its time. Unfortunately, he continued to fly until ran out of gas, had to land gear up in a beet field, and but he set a record. So it kind of showed he had a tendency to kind of go beyond limits. It's one thing to go beyond FAA, CAA limits. Those are man-made limits. You can go by a few of those and still make it. You go by physics, you've had it. So that's what happened. So then he began to still be interested in a transcontinental record, which would be to fly from California, in particular Burbank, back to Newark. But he couldn't do it in this airplane. It had short wings, didn't have enough gas to go there. So what he told was Noah Dietrich and the guys working for him to build another set of wings that would go from about a 35-foot wingspan to a 40-foot wingspan and have more fuel tanks in it, and that would allow him to fly non-stop back to Newark. But it took a while to do that. Meanwhile, he bought a Northrop Gamma from Jacqueline Cochran and modified it. This was fixed gear now, and modified it with an improved engine. And one of the things Howard had found out that wasn't that well known at the time period was that an airplane, let's say if you max it out at low altitude, let's say it goes 250 indicated airspeed, you're doing 250. That's what your true airspeed is, and without wind, that's your ground speed. But if you climbed up to 15, 20,000 feet and fly 250 indicated, guess what? You have a higher true airspeed, and so you can go faster. The other thing I think he began to sense was that in the wintertime over California, you had a jet stream. And if you get up to 35,000, it can be 100 knots. The jet stream moves up to Canada in the summertime, but in the wintertime it's down here, and it always goes west to east. It curls around like a snake a little bit. But he was planning to fly 18 to 20,000 feet, so wintertime you get a good tailwind. So sure enough, in January of 1936, he took this airplane, took off from Burbank at night. Again, he liked to fly at night. Obviously there wouldn't be as much traffic. There wasn't anything in the way of FAA, radar control. You're pretty much on your own. There wasn't much in the way of navigation, except for the lights of the cities. And that's pretty much how he navigated with road maps of the time. You remember they were free? How many people remember road maps being free? They aren't anymore, but they were. And that's what he used. Howard was tight in some ways, and he used road maps. So he flew nonstop at about 9.5 hours, which is not bad, in January of 1936. The following year, the racer now had the long wings and the extra fuel, and so he took off again. This was January of 1937. Took off from Burbank and flew nonstop to Newark in about 7.5 hours, which isn't bad. When you stop and think of it, the 747s go there 4.5, 5 hours, something like that at altitude. So that was, quite a record in 1937. So he whetted his appetite in both speed, top speed, and also in cross-country flying. I might add a funny part about was that once he got it back to Newark, I'm not sure he ever flew the racer again. He hired a guy to fly the airplane back. I think he paid him $500 and specifically told him, guess what? Don't set another record. Don't beat my record. which is not likely to do because you're going against wind. So the airplane came to Culver City. It was in a Quonset hut right next to the building that Dick and I had our offices in. A guy by the name of Bruce Burke was the caretaker of all of Howard's airplanes. And so when we had visiting Air Force, Navy pilots that come in, we could always call Bruce and say, can we show the racer to someone? And so sure enough, you could go over there. It was in this locked building. There was, I think the long wings were still on it, and it was covered with a tarp. And so you could, Bruce said you can't pull the tarp off, but you could get under it kind of like you'd crawl under a tent and lift up. And I remember looking, pilots, you know, the first thing we're going to do is look in the cockpit, right? So looked in the cockpit, and I thought to myself, God, what if Howard was still sitting in that thing, or he'd passed away? He probably would like to do that. That'd be a good place for him to go. At any rate, it stayed in the Quonset hut until about 1976, when through the combination of the working with the government for getting the flying boat, he gave the racer to the Air and Space Museum, and that's where it is located at this time period. So at any rate, now he turned his interest into round-the-world flight. Looked around for airplanes to get, and one that he kind of liked was the Sikorsky S-43. The good thing about it, it's seaplane. There's a lot of ocean when you fly around the world. And what he was going to try and do is beat, what was his name that flew in the early 30s. He had flown around the world in, I'm thinking, 5, 6, 7 days, something like that. But it was more of a northern route. He took off from roughly New York, went across to England. The idea then was to go over to Russia, Siberia, come back through Alaska and Minnesota and back down again. So a lot of water, and he thought this airplane might do it. But it used a lot of fuel and was pretty slow. And really, it didn't look like that would be the right one to get. So a new airplane out was the Lockheed Super Electra L-14. And that's the one that he decided to fly, and was set up now to fly in 1938. Now you remember Amelia Earhart made her attempt to go around the world in 1937. She did it somewhat different in that she went pretty much around the equator, which is 25,000 miles, and she also headed east. Originally her plan was to go westbound, but because of the accident she had in Hawaii, she changed her mind and decided to go eastbound. So Howard's routing was only about 14,800 miles. So it was around the world, but not the same distance. At any rate, I think what was really interesting about this flight was the people that he took with him. He took a couple navigators, a flight engineer. I think there was 5 total people. And it was really, really, really well planned. It's a book that should be written, I think. There's a lot of documents at a museum at the Florida Air Museum where the Sun and Fun is held. They seem to have a whole bunch of original documents, contracts that Howard signed, a lot of photographs, a lot of his planning, maps and things like that. And I've always thought it was probably Howard's peak aviation experience. As a test pilot would do, he planned it very carefully, he thought it through, and he flew it very carefully. And so in some respects it was kind of a ho-hum, but that's what good flight test is ho-hum. When you plan it quite well and then actually fly it quite well, it may not be colorful with crashes and all of that, but that's good testing. So I think that was really his peak experience. So he flew around the world in some 91 hours, a little over 3 days. And this was also at the time period that he was dating Katharine Hepburn. And there's some interesting stories associated with his crew chief and Katharine Hepburn in my book. I obviously don't have time to cover all of the stories that are in the book, so I'm trying to kind of hit the highlights of his activity. This also now had him interested in if you can go around the world in twin-engine airplanes and show that it's safe and somewhat comfortable. Now maybe we need to provide air transportation for other than pilots to passengers. And so guess what? He became a part interest in TWA, and that's quite a story in itself. Well, now fast forward to 1943, he still had the Sikorsky. He loved that airplane. He loved to fly it up to lakes, Tahoe, other places in the West Coast that have lakes. He took a variety of movie stars there and entertained them. He had it outfitted quite well in the night, in the inside of it. And so what happened was that during the war, the government wanted the airplane. They were planning to use it on the East Coast, up in the Northeast, ferrying engineers and equipment up through some of the islands for flying airplanes over to England during World War II. So they were going to take it from him. They had done some modifications so that there'd be an engineering station, some radios in the back. Howard went out to fly it for the last time at Lake Mead, and what Howard didn't know was that it had too far forward of a forward CG. He should have known that. All pilots should know what the center of gravity and the center of gravity limitations on the airplane, because it has a huge effect. An aft CG gives it a wallowing airplane, a forward CG, and you may not have enough to rotate for takeoff or enough to keep it back for landing. Well, this one did not. It had been modified for the radio equipment and modified for an engineer back there to operate it, but that had not been installed. And so he's flying the airplane outside of the CG with several people on board, including the CAA people. And he came in to land and lost it. The airplane crashed into the water, tore itself up and sunk. 2 people were killed. Howard was hurt pretty bad. Another one of his employees was on board the airplane, was quite helpful in keeping him afloat. And so the airplane never went to the government. Howard did have it pulled up, and Bruce Burke and his guys restored the airplane. It was still in Howard's estate when he passed away, and it's still flying someplace in the southeast. So it was another accident that Howard had, and it was a close call for him. Well, everybody recognized this as the #1 XF-11 because of the counter-rotating props. Howard had come up in preparation for World War II. He built an airplane called the D-2. It's made out of wood. And again, the feeling was that you could go faster by making the airplane flush-mounted rivets for metal, but this one was going to be as smooth as can be. And it didn't fly very well. He took it out to the Edwards area, flew it at Harper's Lake a couple times, didn't go very good, but he finally convinced the military to build 100 of these XF-11 aircraft, 2 prototypes, and 105-foot wingspan, supposed to get up to 40,000 feet, fly a long ways. It was a reconnaissance model with cameras in it. And Howard, as usual, wanted to make the first flight on the airplane. And they'd had some problems with it, in particular a leak in the oil of the on the right side engine. But there was no gauge to show where how much oil you had on board. The Air Force had set up some requirements for the first flight. He was supposed to fly 45 minutes. He was supposed to fly with 600 gallons of gas. He put on 1,200. He wasn't supposed to retract the landing gear, which is typical in first flights. Howard retracted the landing gear with problems getting it up. He was supposed to have a chase airplane. He had a chase airplane, but they hadn't coordinated on frequency, so they were not able to talk with each other. So Howard just kind of went out and did it, and the ground crew thought there was enough oil in the engine for 45 minutes, but it turns out there wasn't enough for an hour 20. So we ran out of oil in the right rear propeller, and it probably went into reverse, didn't feather, probably went into kind of a reverse on him. And he was never able to really detect at the time what was wrong. He was still thinking he might have gear problems, had nobody to look at it as he was on a different frequency. And one of the other things that he did that is always kind of interesting is that whenever you have an emergency in the airplane, what do you do? First thing is you alert people on the ground of the emergency if you can, and you land at the nearest suitable airplane for your type airplane, which in this particular case, he could have gone back into Culver City. He could have gone into Santa Monica. But I talked with this Jimmy Kirkpatrick, who was the crew chief on the airplane, and he said Howard was different when it came to a problem with an airplane. What he wanted to do is continue flying, troubleshoot, land, and then tell the mechanics and engineers what was wrong with the airplane. He didn't want to land and have them tell him. So he flew too long and eventually got to the point where he couldn't change altitude, couldn't hold altitude, couldn't change heading, and he was heading north up in the Beverly Hills area. And one of the things that I found in researching about him was that back in his early days here in California, probably in the, I guess it would have been late 20s, early 30s, he was going to play golf in Beverly Hills, and he was going to pick up a passenger in Santa Barbara and bring him back to play golf. Well, he got behind schedule, so when he picked the guy up and came to, I'm sorry, excuse me, instead of landing at Santa Monica, he landed on the golf course. Well, he got in a little trouble, but Noah Dietrich paid, I think, $1,000 to get him off, and this is, early 30s depression. $1,000 would be a lot of money, but got him off the hook. So the feeling is that he was trying to stretch this airplane and get it to the golf course, and he was about 2 blocks short. Went through a couple of homes, and you've probably, if you've seen the movie The Aviator, and a lot of you have, boy, they really play that with that accident up. That was quite a deal, and he really got hurt. And one of the things that was associated with my activities, I was a technical consultant for the movie The Aviator, and I thought they took a lot of liberties in that. The script was kind of screwy, but realizing that the movie was only part educational, it was really entertainment, they kind of played games with a lot of that. But I thought that his crash in the XF-11 was really the turning point with Howard Hughes. He was in the hospital for a little over 30 days. They gave him morphine because of the burns that he had, broken bones, internal injuries. He was in pretty bad shape, wasn't expect to make it, but did make it. But they took him off the morphine and put him on codeine when he left the hospital. And he never got off of drugs after that. He was kind of like Elvis Presley. He had money, he had power, he had influence, he got what he wanted. Howard and Elvis, they could get what they wanted. So he got the drugs, he administered himself, and that's not good in the long run. And as it turns out, it wasn't good for him in the long run. Okay, this is the XF-11 number 2, and now we're in 1947. So what he did, obviously different, was that he got rid of the counter-rotating props, regular props. April of 47, big fanfare on a Saturday morning. He invited members of Hughes Aircraft and the news to come out, and he flew the airplane for about a minute, and he did everything absolutely right and made a very nice landing. It was covered by the Hughes News. A lot of people saw it. But the time was over. The program had been canceled. I mean, the war was over now. It had been over for 2 years. So there was no need for this airplane from a war perspective. As you recall, 1947, Chuck Yeager goes supersonic. So the Air Force is transitioning into jets. This is not a jet. So the airplane was, he flew it that one time. He flew quite a few more test missions on it. He was pretty active in 47. For as badly bunged up as he got in 46, he did fly a lot of in early 47, this April, May, June. Then in later 47, he had the congressional hearings. Remember, he was in trouble because of war profiteering. He had contract for the flying boat that hadn't flown. He had other contracts, and as did other contractors that were building things for the military, for the war, and hadn't been produced. So he was kind of under the gun. So he did fly it for a while, finally gave it to the Air Force. They did some work out at Edwards. They took it back to Dayton. It ended up at Eglin, and I guess it was pounded down for scrap. It's too bad. That would have been a great museum item, wouldn't it? Kind of like your YF-23, even though it lost. A one-of-a-kind airplane, two-of-a-kind as it turns out, just like the YF-23, would have been a great airplane to have in a museum, but it's long gone. Everybody's heard about the flying boat. I'll tell you just a little bit of what I found out concerning that. As you recall, in the hearings that Howard had, he talked about the flying boat, and he said he would fly it or leave this country and never come back. So that was a toughie. When he went out to taxi this again was a weekend. It was a Sunday morning, November 2nd, 1947. Went out for the taxi test, and it's amazing how many people come up to me and say they were there and they saw it taxi. Anybody here that may have been there to see it go? Anyhow, it was supposed to be a taxi run. Howard had an engineer or a mechanic be internal to the wing behind each engine. Had a guy up in the tail. Had a whole bunch of news people on board. Had no life rafts, no vests, no parachutes, no briefing. He got in and he taxied around for a while. And then he pulled back into the docks there, and the news people got off. They thought, that's it, time to go tell their story. And then he went out taxiing again. And the guy that he had on board was a guy by the name of George Haldeman, who had been a test pilot up in the Boeing area for a while, but now worked for the CAA. And he had been involved with not the design, but checking the design and construction. And of course, what was different about this airplane, besides being so huge, is the flight controls. When you put cables on an airplane that is that big, you have a tremendous amount of lag. You pull back on the yoke and nothing happens for a while. So it had hydraulic boosted controls. I think one of the first airplanes, if not the first one, to have boosted controls. And they'd been checked out, but I guess there wasn't a backup to that. So this George Haldeman, who ironically was a member of our Society of Experimental Test Pilots and may have been at some of our symposiums when I was a young test pilot. I wish I had been smart enough to go up to the old guys that were around in the early days, has since long passed away. At any rate, he is on board, and Howard asked if he could fly the airplane, and this guy said, no, your backup system has not been checked out. So here's Howard Hughes. He said he was going to fly the airplane or leave the country, and he's got the FAA guy literally standing in the airplane behind him. That's a pretty tough call. What do you do? We've got to be a lot of pilots in here, and how do you figure out? Well, he taxied. The movie showed the guy that was in the right seat, his co-pilot, was a weatherman. That's not correct. It was Dave Grant, a hydraulic guy. And we think Howard put a hydraulic man in for maybe two reasons. One, if he did fly the airplane, he would have been the only one to fly it. Couldn't say somebody else actually flew it. And maybe he needed some hydraulic information. So anyhow, they're out skipping along. They'd been up to fairly high speeds before, so he had now dropped off the news people, but he still had his crew on board. And it appears that he got up to a similar speed from what he had been before in the airplane, but then he put down takeoff flaps and the thing ballooned up. That's what Haldeman said. It ballooned out of the air. Well, usually the seaplanes don't. It's quite a deal to get them up on the step and get airborne, but supposedly this was kind of designed that it would in fact fly. So it did get airborne, not very long, maybe 20, 30 feet for 30 seconds or so. It wasn't up very long. And there's indications that Howard was somewhat surprised because he pulled the power back, and the engineer said, push it up, because if you pulled the power back, the hydraulic pressure would drop on you, and you needed that for the boost. So they think they put a little back in, let it settle down, and Howard was asked if he was surprised, and he said no, he likes to make surprises. So he may have backed into that. I guess he could play the case that it did fly, so he's off the hook with the Congress. And also the FAA guy, he could say, well, I didn't plan to fly it, it just ballooned up. So crazy as a fox, you kind of wonder about Howard. And it had to be a gutsy call, because realize this is November of 47. In 46, when the XF-11, when he crashed that baby, nobody would have, if they'd been on other people on board, they wouldn't have made it. So to have somebody up in the tail and behind each engine, that's a pretty gutsy call, isn't it? Okay, I think this is the only color photograph of Howard Hughes. Now we're 1952. There'd been this is a jet transport airplane designed in Canada. Actually flew before the 707, but after the Comet, which was in England. And the Canadians were interested in selling it to Howard Hughes because he owned TWA. And Howard was the one that decided what airplanes that TWA would buy, not the marketing people, not the engineers, not management. Howard decided that. So everybody wanted Howard to fly with him. So Avro, who built the jetliner, it was a one-of-a-kind airplane. They had problems. They weren't able to sell it to Canada because the Canadian government didn't think they could handle the airplanes they were supposed to build during the Korean War. That was more important to them. So he couldn't sell it there, so Howard was interested, so they brought the airplane guy down to Southern California, to Culver City, dirt strip, 1952. I don't think it was paved till later 52 or 1953. And so a guy by the name of Don Rogers was the test pilot who I was able to interview, who's since passed away. And I might add that the people that I interviewed, I think the youngest was 83, the oldest was 97. And there may be only 2 people that are still alive. So it was kind of at the end of the road of being able to find people that had a direct connection with Howard Hughes in aviation, get their story. And I was fortunate that the ones that I knew all knew somebody else. And they said, you got to contact so-and-so. He has a great story. And so I kept getting the Howard Hughes stories, which was kind of backwards because I'd written a manuscript about my 20 years as a test pilot with Hughes Aircraft Company, and I thought I'd put in a couple cute Howard Hughes stories in that. Well, it ended up that I had more and more of these cute little stories, and my wife kept saying, you got enough of those, you don't need any more. And I said, well, it's just too much fun to talk with these people about Howard Hughes and what kind of a pilot he was, because I just knew nobody else that was like a Howard Hughes. He was so unique in his time period with the money, power, influence, and interest that he had and the way he went about it. There'll never be another Howard Hughes. So at any rate, that airplane came into Culver City. Don Rogers brought it down. The idea again was that it would be here for a week, 10 days or something like that. Well, it went on and on and on, came up to summertime. Don was concerned because he had married and had a couple children in Canada. And so he said to Howard, I'd kind of like to go home. And Howard says, no, can't come home. I'll fly your family down here. So he flew his family down there, rented a house for him in Hollywood. And Don was excited because it had something you don't have in Canada. What would that be? A swimming pool. And somebody to take care of it. So I think they were there for 6 or 7 months, only flew 6 or 7 times. But Howard would get out there, and this one was a fairly easy airplane to fly, like 80 miles an hour, and final touchdown 65, so it wasn't that fast, big fat wings. Howard was pretty good. He'd shoot touch and goes at Culver City, round and round and round and round and round, and he just seemed to like touch and goes. But that was the first jet aircraft that Howard flew, and to my knowledge, the only color photograph. Well, this is probably my favorite Howard Hughes story. When Dick and I worked for Hughes Aircraft Company, we had a fellow by the name of Al McDaniel, who's still alive. He just passed 90 last September, be 91 next month. And he had been hired by Hughes Aircraft Company in 1950. He was a World War II type, and he flew the 102 and the 106 and all the airplanes of that vintage. By our time period, he wasn't doing much flying, but here's a story that he told me about flying this little twin-engine Beech 18. It was just an airplane that I think was owned by Robert Cummings. Remember the movie star Robert Cummings? And Howard was a friend of his. It was kept at Culver City. They just used it for flying around the LA area. Well, in 1953, guess what? The freeway the 405 is going to be built, and the 405 freeway is supposed to go right through the Hughes property. Well, Hughes doesn't want that. He didn't want that. And so, unlike other people who would, if you were concerned about something happening to your property, you work your way up through the government, right? Howard didn't work his way through the government. He decided that he would fly up to Sacramento and see Governor Warren. And he'd start at the governor. So he scheduled a flight. It was, I think, like in February, wintertime. And Al McDaniel was supposed to fly the airplane. Howard had the local congressman and his senior legal guy on board. So McDaniel tells me he was waiting at the airplane. He'd pre-flighted. He was ready to go. Howard showed up in a car and all three guys got on board. He cranked up, taxied out to runway 23 that we had, and he's waiting to take off to get his clearance. And he got a tap on his shoulder, and he turned around. It was Howard. And Howard said, "We haven't taken off." And McDaniel said, "I don't have my IFR clearance." And Howard said, "Screw it, take off." So he added power, took off. Now he's out over Santa Monica Bay, underneath the clouds, and he thought, McDaniel's thinking, I'll try and get my clearance before I turn northbound. And the same thing, there's a tap on the shoulder, and it's Howard. And he said, "We haven't turned." I said, "Well, I don't have my clearance." "Screw it, turn." So he turns. He's climbing out above, in the weather now, above Van Nuys in that general area. It can be other airplanes flying through the weather, but he doesn't have his clearance yet. So he finally got up on top, and he pulls it back to a cruise setting, props back, throttle, props, mixture and everything. And he's sitting there, and he told me, he said, even though it's wintertime, he's perspiring. It's coming down, his armpits are wet and everything like that. And he's on course, and pretty soon Howard walks forward, takes the two throttles, pushes them all the way to the firewall, and says, "I'm in a hurry." I'm in a hurry. So now he's sitting there, and he watches cylinder head temperatures. They're going from green, orange, getting into the red. How long are the engines going to run in takeoff power? A lot of times there are limits, of 2 minutes or something like that with props of that era, engines of that era. So the only thing he thought he could do was try and just slowly inch these suckers back a little at a time, so that Howard wouldn't hear. Because if Howard heard, he'd be right back up there. So he inched it back. He said he even closed his eyes for a while, because then he thought he could just, sense any change of power. And so all of a sudden he begins to smell something that smells like sulfur. So what could sulfur be? Probably the engine oils overheating, coming apart, imminent engine failure soon. Not a good deal, right? Not a good deal, flying along. So now he's really distressed. So he thought, well, I'll look in the back and see if the passengers have sensed this. So he looks in the back, and what does he see? But Howard Hughes had his pants down, is sitting on a chemical toilet, taking a poop. And it smelled terrible back there. And he said, here was this assemblyman, here was the lawyer. They were practically nose to nose to each other, and they had their ties and shirts on, and they're saying, "Yes, Mr. Hughes, yes, Mr. Hughes." And he's taking a poop. Said, that's the way it was with Howard Hughes. Well, sure enough, they got up there, and the freeway was changed. You notice where it goes by, it didn't cross the runway. So Howard got his way. Well, that's one of my favorite stories. We'll move on. French Caravelle, this was vintage 55. The French also were interested in selling an airplane to Howard Hughes and TWA. So they brought the Caravelle in. Unusual design in that time period, in that the engines were in the back. And up until that time period, most engines were on the wing. And so they brought the airplane in, the French brought they had their marketing people, their engineering people, their pilot and everything, and Howard's up in the front, and they're showing him the cockpit. He's sitting in the seat, looking at it all. And he said, I want to think about this airplane. If you guys don't mind, just please get out of the cockpit. So they get out of the cockpit. He locked the door. He started the engines. He taxied out. Didn't call anybody, didn't call the control tower. What can they do? They're not going to shoot the airplane. And so Howard takes off. And they're thinking, here's the old man has taken off. He doesn't know much about the airplane. How much could you learn about an airplane sitting in the cockpit, having to point to a couple gauges? But everybody knew he loved to shoot touch and goes. So they figured, well, he'll be back around. He'll be shooting touch and goes and touch and goes. We hope he lands before he runs out of fuel, because he doesn't know how much fuel's on board or where it comes or the pumps or anything. He doesn't come back. So they called the control tower over at Van Nuys. They haven't seen him. Burbank, haven't seen him. Nobody's seen him. They're really, really worried. About a week later, they find the airplane at Palm Springs. He flew over, landed at Palm Springs, got out of the airplane, left it there. Who in the world would ever do that? I mean, that is so far out of bounds from anything that most pilots of this generation would know. Okay, here's the Boeing prototype, the Dash 80, one-of-a-kind airplane. Was being flight tested, vintage 1958, up in Seattle. This one was interesting for me because 3 members of my Society of Experimental Test Pilots had been involved with Howard and flying that. They were Harley Baird, Brian Weigel, and Lou Wallach. And so I had 3 people that I could interview that were test pilots that had flown Howard just a couple of times down in the LA area. And so I thought, they probably have a good memory, good mind. I'm getting an accurate story. And this was the same thing. It was just too good to be true. Harley was the first one. He was actually kind of the project pilot on the airplane. But they wanted the marketing people. This is always interesting. The marketing people wanted the airplane to go down so Howard could fly it. He wanted the airplane to fly. There was a TWA facility at LAX, and so that's where the airplane was to be flown in. And so Brian Weigel had been with the company a little bit longer, so the 2 of them brought the airplane down. Again, it's a requirement that you have 2 people in there. So they brought the airplane down to LAX for Howard to fly, and he had it pretty well set up what he wanted. He wanted exactly where they were going to stay and how they were going to do it. So fast forward to the fact that Howard wanted to sit in the left seat. He always wanted to sit in the left seat, not in co-pilot's left seat. So that's where he is going to be. And Brian Weigel was going to fly the co-pilot seat and move Harley back to the flight engineer position. So they're all in the airplane. Howard comes up, his driver comes up, he gets on board with his chocolate and his milk and things like that, and he wanted to talk. And so here's the story that he tells Brian Weigel. He says that, and Howard told this story to him. He said that a few years earlier, he had a Connie, the Lockheed 4-engine Constellation, and Howard flew it by himself. No co-pilot, no flight engineer. Can you believe that? 4-engine airplane by yourself. But he flew B-23, the Convair 240, a variety of multiple engine airplanes. I'm not sure exactly what the rules were, but I would think as a minimum you'd have to have a co-pilot in the Connie. But Howard was back on the East Coast and was planning to come out to the West Coast and had his Connie. This is the story that he tells. He took off, landed at Kansas City, refueled, got back in the airplane, took off, leveled off, put the airplane on autopilot, got his briefcase out, took his papers out, and he's starting to do some work. And Howard could work at any time, at any place, whether it was a restaurant, you name it, he could do that. And so he's working, looking at some of his paperwork, and suddenly he sees something kind of going by the windscreen, catches his attention, looks up, and it's trees. It's the trees of Colorado. He had leveled off at 7,000, 8,000, 9,000 feet. And it was dusk. If it had been nighttime, he'd have probably gone right into the mountains. But that caught his attention, so he climbed up, and away he went. That's the story told. Now what does Howard do in the Dash 80? He takes off nighttime, goes out to Mojave. At the time, that was a Marine reservist field, and certainly not built up to the degree it is now. Not that it's built up very good even now, but he shoots touch and goes. And the guys from Boeing had been told, do what Howard wants to do in the airplane, but be safe. Don't wreck the airplane, don't crash or anything like that. So Howard's flying the airplane. He never took instruction. He just, did it the way he liked to do things. And so according to this Harley Baird, he flew a fairly low angled approaches to the airplane, to the runway. And then when he was out some distance, he'd pull all the power back. And so now he's low, power's off the airplane, they're sitting low. They didn't feel very comfortable that they were going to make it to the end of the runway. Even Harley said you felt like you had to have a periscope to see the runway. But they kind of let him do it, and I think he shot 37 touch and goes or something like that, a huge number. He didn't do stall series, wind up turns, asymmetric power, just these damn touch and goes. So finally they come back to LA, and they'd called in the radar, and they said level 7,000 feet. Howard just passed right through 7,000 feet, didn't call anybody. And so that, they're on the radio saying, well, we need 3,000 feet, because that appeared where Howard was going. He didn't fly the final approach speeds that they had given him, because, of course, he didn't know what final approach speed was, so he's flying way too fast. And as he's coming in to land, a portion of one flap broke off and landed, I think, in a drive-in theater in Inglewood or something like that. And so by the time they landed and taxied in, the FAA was there. And didn't look good, right? When the FAA meets you, they're not going to say, what a great landing you just made. This is going to be trouble. In this day and age, while you're airborne, they tell you to call area code 661 and a number, and that's not a good sign. 661's Palmdale, and you don't want to have to do that. Anyhow, Howard stayed in the airplane and told Harley to go down there and see how much money that guy wants. He was going to buy him off. So Harley said, let me see what I can do. So he went down there and he said, was there anybody hurt? Nope. Was any damage done? Nope. He said, well, is there anything you need to do? No, we just wanted to let you know that something had come off. And was Howard on board the airplane? I said, I can't tell you that. So anyhow, he managed to skip out of that. They had other incidents. His wife, Jean Peters, was on one of the flights and was talking to Harley, who was acting as the flight engineer, and she wondered if she could have a smoke. She was a cigarette smoker, but Howard didn't like her to smoke. So he said, yeah, but, kind of move to the back. So he went to the back, and Howard's looking around and didn't see her, so he got up out of his seat, and she's smoking a cigarette next to Harley, and so she sees Howard coming, so she hands the cigarette to Harley. But guess what? There was lipstick on the cigarette. So Howard, crazy as a fox, he thought something was going on with his wife. Anyhow, the stories were just too good. I just got such a kick out of them, and I could go on, but those were some good stories about that. Later, he was to, and I'm getting close to the end of the time here, so he did then fly with a guy by the name of Vern Peterson in the Jetstar, Johnny Knievel, who's still alive, in the Convair 880 down in San Diego. And Howard's last flying was in vintage 1973. He was over in England, London, and wanted to fly. And initially he wanted to have, he hadn't flown for quite some time. Howard would have been 71-ish at that time period, or let's see, even less than that. So they couldn't get one of his airplanes over there, but he decided that he would fly with the de Havilland Company. And so again, a Society of Experimental Test Pilot friend of mine by the name of Tony Blackman worked for Hawker over there, and he flew Howard, I think, about 4 flights. And this was June of 1973. Again, Howard sat in the left seat. For some reason or other, again, they flew at nighttime. And you would think weather would be fairly good in England in June, but if you think of D-Day and all the problems that they had in selecting the right weather for World War II, it was pretty bad weather in England in June. And so he flew a couple of flights, same kind of thing, pretty weird flying, but now Howard hadn't flown for a long, long time. And he bought a couple of airplanes from them. He never flew them. They ended up in his estate. So Howard had a fall that August and broke a hip and never was out of bed again. Died in 1976 at the age of 71. What a career that he had. Okay, so the next slide that I have here, is this Howard Hughes? No, it is not Howard Hughes. I'll tell you who it is. It's a guy by the name of Freddie Goslin, who came to work for Hughes Aircraft Company after the war. He had tried to get into show business in New York, which is where he was from, came out like so many people did to break into Hollywood, and had a job as a janitor at Hughes Aircraft Company in our flight test division, which is where all the pilots were located, all of our personal equipment, our helmets, our oxygen masks, flight suits, parachutes, all of that material was there. And so as he'd clean up the room, jet pilots were pretty new at this time period. He wanted to put on the helmet, and they said, nope, you can't put on a jet helmet. That's personal equipment to the pilot, just like your shoes would be. You wouldn't let somebody wear your shoes. But he wanted to do it. He kept asking. They always said no, no, no. Finally, he's up for retirement. He's age 65. He'd signed all the paperwork. He's down to the final thing. All he has to do is turn in his security badge to the guard, and he's gone. But the guard happened to be right next to where the flight equipment was. And so he asked one more time, can I wear the helmet? And they said, okay, go ahead, put on the helmet. So he put on the helmet. Of course, everybody laughed. So he took out his teeth. That's why you see him there like that. He hadn't shaved for a while. And so everybody got a big, big kick out of that photograph because it's the kind that people put captions on because you had hoped that defending your country would not be a jet pilot looking like that. They even had the flight suit they put on, and I think it was Bob DeHaven, for those of you who, he was our senior test pilot at Hughes, and he had shot down 14 Japanese airplanes in World War II, got out of the service, stayed in the reserve, and I think was a full colonel. So my guess is, judging from the wings there, that may have, and it has full colonels on here, that may have been Bob DeHaven's flight suit. So he wouldn't have cared for that either. At any rate, a Hughes photographer took a picture of that, and that one went around the world with all kinds of captions on it. So, but it wasn't Hughes aircraft, was not Howard Hughes, and it wasn't me. Okay, so my time's about over. It's your time. Questions and answers. What question about the flying boat? It's up at McMinnville in Oregon. It was moved up there in the 90s, taken apart, shipped up, put back together. It's a great site. For those of you that are obviously interested in museums, you got to go see the flying boat.
Thank you for watching Peninsula Seniors Out and About here at the Western Museum of Flight and Torrance. I'm Betty Wheaton. I'll see you next time.